Okay, so thank you for joining us for the second and last alumni panel of the day. It's titled Sensing Place, Thinking Space. For those of you who are joining just now, my name is Emilio Vavarella, and I will be moderating this panel. We have a slightly different structure, so we are going to have 4 shorter 12 minutes long presentations, and then we will move into the Q&A with questions from the public. And I would like to begin with an anecdote from one of our last group chats as we were planning for this panel. We were talking about translation. Translation as movement and translation as transformation. These are concepts that are recurrent in Giuliana's work, and I see many people are nodding. So as we were talking about that, Yazmín mentioned a sentence from Édouard Glissant, which says, "I speak to you in your language, but I understand you in mine." A kind of metaphor, as Becca noticed, for what students do when they learn from someone else. And that is indeed what we also did here at Harvard. Giuliana spoke to us in her language, and each of us understood her in our own way. Today, we pay homage to that. Yeah. Okay. I have a very short introduction. So let's get straight to the fun part. Our first panelist for the second part of the day is Dan Damour, who received his doctorate in film and visual studies from Harvard in 2022 under Giuliana's supervision. Dan is a postdoctoral researcher at Filmuniversitat Babelsberg. He's a member of the European Research Council project Cinematic Atmospheres Towards a New Ecology of the Moving Image, and is currently at work on a book project on atmospheric operations across screen cultures. His presentation is titled Classroom Lessons. Join me in welcoming Dan Damour.
I would like to first, of course, echo all the thanks for the coordinators and organizers of the event, especially Emilio. So thank you once again. I'm sure it will be echoed once more. But yes, so I first came across Giuliana's work while I was an undergraduate through Atlas of Emotion, and my honors thesis was thoroughly indebted to that work, probably a little too much. But so the opportunity then to become her student was an immense stroke of luck. And over my time in graduate school, I've spent a lot of hours in the classroom with Giuliana, first as a student and then as a teaching assistant. And so I wanted today to pay it back a little bit and say thank you. And also to share some of the lessons I learned, and of course also to share some of the lessons I learned from the amazing group of students, eclectic and creative students that she attracts to her many great classes. So, what I would like to briefly reflect on are some of those lessons now, and I want to do so through an example of something that's not far from her own work, although I want to work in a slightly different register, and that when I revisited recently for my project on superimpositions as atmospheric operations in cinema and other art forms, I was struck at how impossible it was to disentangle it from my own memories and experiences of those books and classes. It's a short essay by Eisenstein on some etchings by Piranesi, and now known by the title Piranesi and the Fluidity of Forms. Conceptually, its treatment of the transportative and transfigurative force of art that Eisenstein marks as its pathos and ecstasy is resonant with Giuliana's own empathic work on moving images and projection. But is Eisenstein's evocative description of his experience and analysis of the etchings, his ecstatic form of ekphrasis, in other words, that reminded me so vividly of Giuliana's own masterful talent on the page or in the classroom, of drawing her audience in and sensitizing them to the ways in which art and space, textures and materials constantly alter shape and invite the ways that we look, move, think, and feel. This lesson then is on the importance of description as more than the mere accumulation of details, as any faithful objective inventory of qualities. is a lesson and reminder that description is as much critical as it is creative, as much analytical as transformative. As a pedagogical operation, description continually makes and remakes the dynamic relationship not only between object and beholder, but between self and other. One could say that the art of description is thus also an art of projection. So briefly, Eisenstein's essay on Piranesi was a late piece of the director's work, written sometime within the last few years of his life, between heart attacks and the halted production of Ivan the Terrible. The essay was intended element of a major work on aesthetics, non-indifferent nature, that collected and reworked earlier essays, as well as evolving his views on cinema and montage, and further elaborating what he viewed as the shared and fundamental dialectical process of nature and art. He opens, there's the man. He opens the section by situating himself, narrating in the first person in the study of his beloved apartment, relaying his view out the window, his apartment building built for employees of the State Cinema Studios. It overlooks the fields where he had shot battle scenes in Alexander Nevsky. However, his gaze begins to move throughout his sunny yellow environs. He calmly leads his readers along as his attention settles onto an important and cherished object of his, an etching by the 18th century Venetian engraver extraordinaire Piranesi. He identifies the print as coming from the artist's early series of various works of architecture and its title of Carcera Oscura, or Dark Prison. At this point, he confesses that despite his long interest in Piranesi, he is more of an enthusiast than a connoisseur, even admitting that he once misidentified Dark Prison as belonging to Piranesi's most famous series of works, the multiple editions of the Carceri, or his imagined prisons. Never timid, however, Eisenstein proceeds to further train his attention to the etching, relating his surprising and seemingly spontaneous reaction to the print's contrasting impact to that later series. He claims that, unlike those perturbing scenes, this dark prison seems unexpectedly harmless, with little feeling. More so, it's unecstatic. In the preceding pages of the second section on pathos, Eisenstein had analyzed a series of paintings by El Greco. Similar to what he's about to perform with Piranesi, he compared earlier versions of the expulsion of the moneylenders from the temple, characterized by their placid and unecstatic inertia, and through their subsequent charged and dynamic metamorphosis. When looking at Dark Prison, Eisenstein can all but help but begin applying those lessons in a series of ecstatic operations on the etching, so as to release its own potential as an organic, expressive unity. He calls this series of critical operations his ecstatic transfigurations, or more succinctly, explosions. However, his intent is not to demolish, but rather to transform and reconstruct. Starting with its so-called original state, he emits appreciation for the etching's flowing lyrical mood, its daring yet restrained manner, characterized not by his favorite collisions or bursts, but by its dissolution. Its contrasts are not disruptive, but transitional. Airy volumes are balanced by dark masses. The etching's soft, silvery light flows forth as gradual illumination. Whatever ecstasy expressed and activated is partial and primarily potential. A tender series of rivulets dammed by its balanced composition. That serenity is quickly interrupted, first by a systematic breakdown and inventory of its primary elements, encompassing its encompassing general arch, the series of arches along its perspectival recession, stairways, columns, windows, tiles, and so on. With the field surveyed, he launches the fusillade. First, the framing arch explodes, flung out beyond the borders of the etching. The arch leaps out of material and out of form, transforming from circular stone arch to a wooden lattice. Everything underneath is likewise hurled out, beyond its borders, its orientation again leaping from the vertical to the horizontal. Likewise, each arch in the arcade is thrust upward, leaping from a semicircular form to an arrow-shaped Gothic span. The single staircase is broken up, set into multiple courses, like a stroke of lightning in zigzag fashion. It's hurling through space, setting off another series of transformations, in which balconies and columns buckle and break, reforming as a bridge that descends and disappears into the distance. Finally, ropes and blocks also, in various details themselves, explode and multiply into areas that did not even exist in the first vertical state of the etching. Eisenstein's clipped prose, staccatic line breaks, and dense bursts of analysis, digressions, and paradoxes make it easy to draw a correspondence between his style, his montage, and his subject matter, where each reported jolt of perspective is experienced as a series of cuts. Each explosion of scale, each whirlwind, and each concertina redirection and reorientation functions as and enables a progression of unexpected qualitative leaps, hurling the spectator into its depths. The frenzy of Piranesi's nightmarish labyrinths both present and produce an ecstatic experience. Like the combined images produced by his earlier theories on the calculus and montage, at the end of these explosions, we are left with a new image, a mental image. This new ecstatic carcera is retained as a superimposition on the brain, as Eisenstein draws back out of the etching and returns to the exploration of his sun-drenched study, itself a contrast and leap from the formal tempest back into the cozy domestic. Then slyly, through a shift in pacing, as the reader's eyes scan over the sentences, Eisenstein prepares the essay's most effective coup, narrating his gaze, as it lands on a second Piranesi etching. The second etching, as it turns out, is the imagined exploded reconstruction manifest. A sequence not only of analysis, but of rhetorical legerdemain. Through his narration, as we follow the path of his eyes and his mental maneuvers, we are led to imagine that we follow his train of thought, though dramatically obscures what was likely the product of a comparative analysis. The gesture is less critical manipulation, or even a clever gimmick, but an attempt to provide holistic description of the dialectical leaps between perception, cognition, and experience. And so because of this willful slippage between etchings, there's also a tension between the works themselves, his description, but also the various methods and means by which he develops his analysis objects. His inventory of elements and their diagrammatic relation can be mapped, but not reduced. The vectors of the explosions and transformative leaps likewise jostle against their descriptions, the move to the horizontal, the thrust of the arches, the extension of stairs, the buckling of columns, the transition of form, and the layering and telescoping of perspectives. All images that jostle and juxtapose themselves in an attempt to discern the path as one image moves outside itself. So also, there's a little bit of trickery too, and maybe it's performance on his part, but under the cover of his so-called enthusiasm and not connoisseurship, he is also able to both acknowledge the actual transformations that characterize the different states and editions of the Carceri, while also hurl them beyond any sober art historical chronology. Rather, it is to resituate the work within an ecstatic flow. Central to the section of non-indifferent nature to which it belongs, as well as much of late Eisenstein's theoretical work, are the related but distinct terms pathos and ecstasy, which he uses to both trace the migration of images across time and cultures, as well as the agency of those images, the ways in which they act on the mind, body, and emotions of their spectators. For Eisenstein, pathos is an emotional and passionate aspect of art, a formulation of its dynamism. Attendant to life and movement, Eisenstein presents the study of pathos as a tracing of the expressive, emotional energy that projects through different materials and manifestations. Likewise, ecstasy was characteristic of both art and its moving experience. In its most powerful and pure operations, Eisenstein claims ecstasy as a transport, quote, transport out of concepts, out of representation, out of images, out of any rudiments of consciousness whatsoever, into the sphere of pure effect, feeling, sensation, or, and as he plays in the Greek root, out of any static state. So in a straightforward sense, both in his clear exposition of himself in relationship to the prints in his yellow room and the description of the works, Eisenstein's essay on Piranesi can be characterized as a piece of ekphrastic writing. A classical critical trope, ekphrasis generally refers to a literary and rhetorical method of summoning up through words to create an impression of a visual stimulus, object, or scene. Over time, ekphrasis gained a general definition repeated throughout classical handbooks as, quote, descriptive speech that brings the subject shown before the eyes with visual vividness. Ideally, its power was transformative, able to take the figurative presence of something shown and make it into a literal apparition before the eyes. The text most dedicated to this practice was Philostratus the Elder's Imagenes, composed in Greek sometime in the beginning of the 3rd century AD. Philostratus frames the book as a tour through a gallery and its praiseworthy collection of panel paintings on a property somewhere outside the city walls of Naples. The traveling sophist begins his examinations at the prompting of his host's young son and local students, who ask him to interpret the paintings. His evocative descriptions of various figures, events, landscapes, and even still lives, many drawn from literature and mythology, are doubly didactic. They both interpret the scenes for a student audience while also instructing them in analysis and, just importantly, rhetoric itself. At times, the content of the tableau is less important than the experiences summoned by the orator, in which ekphrasis is less descriptive than performative. As both a critical and pedagogical tool, ekphrasis provides not only the hope that representation can, effectively and without distortion, communicate the subject and argument of its originator, but also to instruct their listeners in the mode of experience of thought. Ekphrasis does not just merely represent its object, but also how to approach it, how to see in order to describe, how to describe in order to persuade, how to see so others see, and how to see as they may. As Manfredo Tafuri recognized, the violence inflicted by Eisenstein on Piranesi's Carcere can be interpreted as an attempt to make the etching itself speak and to multiply its ambiguities. Fundamentally, ekphrasis would have the same exact potential as any other mode of representation, but must also work to describe both the dynamics of its object as well as invoke the experience of being, quote, and this is from Eisenstein, being organically tied, merged and united with it, just as one feels himself one with and merged with the organic environment and nature surrounding them. More than just an imaginary occupation of Piranesi's prisons, a being trapped figure ascending an infinitude of stairs, Eisenstein's pathic description of Piranesi initiates a sensory, mental, and emotional bond that not only unites the spectator to the work, but with their immediate and dynamic environment that surrounds them. Each explosion not only sends the stones of the Carcere into new formations, but propels the spectators into new dialectical transformations and their own endless motions of becoming. And so Eisenstein's study, like St. Jerome's, the room serves as an engine of knowledge and a vehicle for transportation. It was not just an apartment or living space, but another work of montage. And in the numerous and ongoing efforts to preserve his apartment, the goal is not simply to house and catalog the books and objects that made up the orbit of Eisenstein's singular work, but also to preserve it as a site of connection and dialogue among visitors, international luminaries from stage and screen, as well as his students and collaborators. Following his death, the movement of his goods from temporary apartment to temporary apartment, his library and study remained a shrine and a forum to discuss not only his considerable legacy, but continue the connections and conversations on a global scale. However, it also stands as a cautionary lesson not just to the to entropic decay or the teeth of time, but as Eisenstein knew well, of official and state favor, and restaging the importance of new and different means of mediating space and history. To be able to see on the page or the screen the glimpses of another time, place, and feeling. And so among the lessons to take from Eisenstein, again, is not perhaps the specific claims about Piranesi, the dialectical nature of ecstasy, or the specifics of his explosive methods as critical or even rhetorical models. Rather, it is in his sensitivity and his insistence on the dynamics of the critical and pedagogical practices, in which both creation and analysis, both teaching and learning, are all acts of imagination. Eisenstein's ecstatic transfigurations of both Piranesi's visions and his own yellow study reveal the widening scope of emotional landscapes, as well as inspire the lowercase ecstasy of teaching and learning, wherein the space of the classroom is transportative and transformative. In it, a pedagogical hope matches an ekphrastic one, whereby boundaries between mediums, sense, and objects, between history, disciplines, and minds, are not definite and permeable, nor are they tightly regulated. Distinctions and differences are not barriers, but gifts for each other's mutual benefit, providing a basis for the transmission of knowledge and insight, of effect and feeling. Is a site grounded but not limited by its materiality? The table and chairs, the walls and screens, and the bodies in between. Through imaginative description and careful guidance, one space transforms into another. And through dialogue, through the exchange of ideas, research and experience, the classroom becomes polymorphic and mobile. Through the direction of the best teachers, the classroom is an archive, a laboratory, a cinema, a gallery, a garden. And though structured by the calendar, the seminar is not bound to it. Its lessons, like its conversations, outlast its syllabus. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was amazing. Our second speaker is Becca Voelcker. Becca earned a PhD from Harvard in 2021, supervised by Giuliana, in a project bridging film studies, art history, and social anthropology. Becca is a historian of visual culture, currently based in the UK, and she lectures at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her first book, Land Cinema in an Age of Extraction, is a cross-cultural history of eco-political cinema, forthcoming with University of California Press. Becca's presentation is titled Landscape Portraits. Join me in welcoming Becca Voelcker.
Thank you very much, Emilio, for organizing this, to all the other speakers on the panel, to Emily Amendola for all your work, to Laura Fram for all your work, and of course, most of all, to Giuliana. You're the reason we're here today and smiling so much. Atlas of Emotion was the first book that introduced me to Giuliana's work. I was in my Cambridge College library and, crouching down, found it in a bookshelf and found myself still in the same position many hours later, marveling at its scope. Atlas wove a tapestry of ideas across geographic regions, historical periods, and material media. And the book made me want to write. It matters what ideas we use to think other ideas with, wrote the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern. Giuliana thinks with images. In her work, visual artifacts are vehicles for thought. Images are metaphors, and I'm thinking of this beautiful etymology of metaphor in the word for transport. Images transport us from one idea to another. Atlas is crisscrossed with such journeys. Its quickness of thought, its agility of articulation, stayed with me long after I left the library. I moved to Tokyo, immersing myself in a completely different visual culture and language, and then to Harvard to begin my PhD in 2015. And that's where I met Giuliana, wearing some amazing jewelry, as always. I took her seminar in my first semester, and then was lucky enough for Giuliana to become my PhD supervisor, my mentor, and my friend. Almost a decade on, I have students of my own, a second book on the way, and work with BBC Radio. And much of what I teach and write and broadcast grows from seeds that Giuliana planted, these seeds of ideas. And that image of seeds coming from, maybe I'm not pressing it hard enough. There you go. That image of seeds, which Dan also finished a beautiful presentation with, is germane to thinking about my first book, which developed from the PhD with Giuliana. And there are many seeds and soils and sites in this book. The book explores the lives and the works of 10 filmmakers and filmmaking collectives in the 1970s and 1980s. Each of them understood land as a locus of social and environmental responsibility, and film as a political tool. And land cinema is a history written for the present. Proposing this new term, land cinema, as an urgent genre for our time, the book reveals how images and ideas produced half a century ago sowed seeds for climate justice today. Diving into little-known regions and archives and exploring films that resonate across geographies, the book unearths key examples of eco-political counterculture. It's full of landscape portraits of lands and the people who cared for them. There are farmer filmmakers in Japan, this is Ogawa Productions, and in Mali, the collective Soman Kidikura, a gardener filmmaker in Massachusetts, Anne Charlotte Robertson. There are filmed portraits of women in Los Angeles, this is Barbara McCullough, in Orkney, Margaret Tate, in the Navajo Nation, Arlene Bauman, and there are indigenous documentaries about land dispossession in Colombia, this is Marta Rodriguez and Jorge Silva. Every practice in the book connects situated local perspectives to planetary ones. Filmmakers in the book understood that their experiences related to those of other people across the world. For example, experiences of land dispossession or pollution. The anthropologist and filmmaker Elizabeth Povinelli has recently called this a shared but differential relation to extractive capitalism. In response to this relation, land cinema filmmakers and artists cultivated responsibility across borders and sometimes across species borders. And the period in question, so 1970s, 1980s, was really a time of internationalism. Films, books, ideas, people traveled. Many land cinema filmmakers shared reference points, connecting feminist, anti-colonialist, and environmental ideas in this constellation, this large conversation about climate justice. So taking my cue from these filmmakers, I wrote the book in a way that connects to places, connects with ideas. Inspired by Atlas of Emotion, land cinema understands that ideas travel. In her seminars, Giuliana spoke of how films can move audiences politically and emotionally. And inspired by that possibility, my book understands that every film, every image is a perspective, a narrative, an edit, crafted from someone's point of view and shaping somebody else's. Giuliana's work pays close attention to the body. She teaches us that the body is a sensual, laboring, gendered, historically situated creator of material and meaning. In land cinema and in my teaching, I'm asking questions about bodies in place. My body's obviously so weak, this is really... Okay, great. Maybe it's jet lag, we can say that. Who made this image? Where? How? From what materials? On whose land? How did it arrive in this archive? Who sees it now? And these questions shape my second book, which I'm currently writing. It's a history of collective identity, told through images and objects. Learning from Giuliana's expanded temporal and methodological breadth, this book explores how people throughout history have envisioned and visualized identity. Oh, thank you. It's for the weak ones. Picture, for example, a national flag, a constitution, a meal, a map, a wedding ring. Each of these objects reveals something about shared identity. Each is a perspective, an edit, telling us who we are and how we should relate to others. Traversing media, regions, and eras, I write with a curatorial approach inspired by Giuliana's that understands the dynamic possibilities of juxtaposition. Each medium is less a boundary than an aperture. Cinema helps us think architecture. Architecture helps us think fashion. Fashion helps us think painting. Visual artifacts are vehicles for thought. I remember Giuliana calling this approach a traveling method, fueled by curiosity and practiced by wandering. The traveling method is skeptical of endings, of destinations. Instead, the scholar constantly moves forward in her project of media cultural archaeology, responding to objects that do not wish to remain static. Images and ideas relate across media, space, and time. They traverse, they translate on visual voyages. Giuliana's voyaging voyeuse, the itinerant theorist, sees gaps, omissions, erasures, blanks where an image might have been, words not written, names like Elvira Notari, less known than they should be. Giuliana's 1993 book, Street Walking on a Ruined Map, travels with photographs, film stills, synopses, and newspapers. These are paratexts, fragments, clues. There is much missing, but gaps also offer breathing spaces, moments to pause, to look, to question the writing of history, history's erasures. And this sense of aperture is a speculative and political opening. For the writing of feminist media histories, such apertures are crucial. It's in the off-screen space, Giuliana teaches us. It's in women's hands, in invisible labor, that some of our most powerful works of art, film, and architecture are made. Undoubtedly, this attention to history's gaps and to women's labor infuses my own work with a commitment to tell her story in history. Land cinema is about men and women, but without labeling or belaboring the point, it is a celebration of women's work. Anne Charlotte Robertson in her Massachusetts garden, Martha Rodriguez on a flower plantation in Colombia, Arlene Bauman on a Navajo reservation, Barbara McCullough in a demolished neighborhood in Los Angeles. These women worked on the margins to expose their own marginalization. Their films unearth flattened narratives, sites where women's creativity has been bulldozed or buried. There, in the supposed wastelands, they filmed to cultivate alternatives to their dominant and deadly present. And as for the book's theoretical interlocutors, Trinity Minha, Fatima Tobing Roni, Pooja Rangan, each woman writing with a deep understanding of history's erasures and cinema's misrepresentation, and writing too with a faith in the potential of other narratives, other perspectives. I'm picturing seeds again, films as seeds, cinemas as gardens of unruly, raucous planting, the cross-pollination of ideas. I always love talking about etymologies with Giuliana. Words are capsule histories, often containing multiple languages, traveled and transformed by use. And the word theory is a favorite one. It comes from the Greek word for spectator. And what better way to appreciate Giuliana today? She teaches us to look and to theorize, how to think through our eyes.
What a beautiful presentation. It's really amazing. Okay, our third speaker, I have the pleasure to introduce Martín Cobas professor of architectural history and design at the Facultad de Arquitectura, Diseño y Urbanismo of the Universidad de la República in Montevideo, where he also chairs the Department of the History of Architecture. Martín works at the intersection of architecture, landscape, territory, and the environmental humanities. He holds a Master in Design Studies from Harvard's GSD, where he studied with Giuliana, and a PhD from Princeton University. His presentation is titled Predation, More and Less Than Human Bodies, or How to Photograph a Painting Standing Up. Join me in welcoming Martín Cobas.
Thank you, Emilio, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Giuliana, for the invitation. I met Giuliana, of course, in Le Corbusier's skylit seminar room, today kind of legendary room in this auditorium. And then we met in my hometown, Montevideo, a few years ago, and very recently in my dissertation defense, where Giuliana was a reader. And I would like to mention just a couple of things that I really, that I would say I learned from Giuliana. Very simple and basic things, but very important things for me. The first one is the power of metaphor as a methodological tool, but also as a methodological pleasure in a way. And the second is of course, the power of images. To the point that I started to understand architecture, even at its most tectonic, as an assemblage of images. It's a little bit dangerous, probably. All right, so I think I will, to read this, I can't see you, but can't do the two things at the same time. In an extended footnote of civilization, oh, sorry, I'm also weak. Yes. In an extended footnote of Civilization and its Discontents, Sigmund Freud speculated on the interrelated sexual, social, and sensory implications of adopting an erect posture. Importantly, he argued, it signals the displacement from the primacy of olfactory to visual stimuli. In short, this momentous process of cultural evolution inaugurates the long gaze. In 1981, Brazilian ethnophotographer Araquém Alcântara photographed his father, Manuel Voelcker, standing at the Juraiaita Teens Ecological Station in Peruíbe, near Sao Paulo. Naked, the old bearded man faces the camera holding a robustly framed painting with his hands. Voelcker denounces the ecological devastation of the territories of his ancestors. Circa 1970, in the Sao Paulo Museum of Art, not so far from Voelcker's contested site, an anonymous photographer depicted Amedeo Modigliani's René, painting from 1917, exhibited in one of the cavaletes de vidro or glass easels designed by Italian-born Brazilian architect Lina Bobardi, so that a lady with a dark skirt, presumably while reading the painting's card, completes the portrait with her own body as if in a composite image. Can architecture and images convey a most bodily and creaturely act at the precise moment man abandoned his most animal trait? What if we imagine the museum as a predatory field, the territory of the predator, a performative space unfolded in time, in which cognition is not regulated by the symbolic machinations of language, but rather by an intense visual semiosis? This non-linguistic communication, probably a form of creaturely rhetoric, would delineate an affective field populated by all forms of sensible life, to therefore establish a new ecology of relations and altogether an anthropology beyond the human. So therefore, I'm interested in looking at the Museum of Lina Bobardi not only as a case study, but also as a sort of situated or side thought experiment. Taking this threefold narrative as my first cue, albeit in their peculiarly entangled mediality, this paper seeks to explore the role and agency of architecture and images in conveying the creaturely, or our animal reserve, in the kingdom of the upright. To this end, I focused the discussion on Bobardi's subversive museographic invention, the Cavaletes de Vidrio, exploring their historical sources and variations from preternatural rocks to concrete blocks, well beyond conventional historiographic lineages, and through new archival evidence, reinterpreted alongside recent developments in ontological anthropology. And I'm specifically referring to Philippe Descolas' Ecology of Others, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's Cannibal Metaphysics, and Eduardo Korn's Anthropology Beyond the Human. All forms of intervening in the classical dichotomies of modern Western metaphysics: nature, culture, human, animal, reality, representation. The ur objects of this narrative are the Cavaletes de Vidrio, or glass easels, an idiosyncratic, quasi-anthropomorphic museographic dispositif devised by Bobardi for the main exhibition hall of the Sao Paulo Museum of Art. This consists of a concrete base and a glass plane on which the paintings are supported. Crucially for this argument, the paintings and their metadata cannot be viewed simultaneously. The viewer is in fact forced to decouple visual and textual cognition in space and time. Detached from both physical walls and art historical location, the title cards removed to the back, paintings perform in a free-floating space and time, adrift as it were. And this is the title card in a conventional museum, and this is the title card in Bobardi's museum. Or this one. Or better, both of them. Relying on complex spatial effects and visual traits studied by the empirical sciences of the 19th century, from retinal after images to peripheral vision, binocular vision, trompe-l'œil, and mise en abîme, were explored in paintings such as Holbein's The Ambassadors or Velázquez's I think it's not working. Well, it works if I really press very hard. These are the title cards. Oops. All right. The political undertones of this operation have been well documented. The sacralization of the artwork, the removing of its aura, its decolonizing effect, the demythification of elite art, or even of the notion of a masterwork, to make it more widely accessible, as well as their immediate sources and precedents, considered by art and architecture historians alike. This includes Bobardi Milanese sojourn and her engagement with Italian disegno. An example, Franco Albini's design for the Scipioni and black and white exhibition at the Pinacoteca di Brera in 1941. Well, this is supposed to be a series of images. And as you see, you always see the images through other images, the paintings through other paintings, in their space, in their media, and in their also materiality and texture. Oops. It's really hard. Sorry. Within the archival evidence that I reclaim as fundamental for fully understanding the conceptual implications of the glass easels, I will briefly introduce two episodes: the exhibições didáticas, or didactic exhibitions, held at the Old Museum at Rua 7 de Abril between 1947 and 1951, and the experimental work of the Seminario de Cinema, to then move towards more specifically ethnanthropological territories. In short, the didactic exhibitions consisted of a series of panels, each a Masonite square with sides measuring 1.32 meters, containing photographic reproduction of artworks and brief accompanying text meant to introduce the general public to the world of art history in a synthetic and direct way. The first of these exhibitions comprised 76 thematic panels, ranging from cave paintings to sculpture, architecture, and contemporary art. Although initially conceived in an early film strip fashion, presenting the artworks in chronological succession as photograms, the panels evolved into more complex visual syntaxes. In fact, their goal was to overcome teleological narratives, favoring instead a non-evolutionary and non-linear approach. Pietro Maria Bardi, then director of the museum and working closely with Bobardi, opened a report to the International Congress of Museums in which he discussed the experience of the didactic exhibitions, noting the continuous nature of historical time. These are the iterations of the configuration of the panels. There is no interruption of continuity. There is no bound in the history of human development. Every event, every fact or gesture has its reason, by which it is bound to the past in a kind of living resonance. Oops. With one of these panels in mind, I would like to move to my second episode or scene. This takes us to the most radical film produced in the Seminario de Cinema, Os Tiranos, a tabletop documentary with a duration of 7 minutes, directed by Plinio Garcia Sanchez and written by Marcos Margulis, both professors of the Seminario, in 1951. Os Tiranos was filmed in 35 millimeters and consists of a series of photographic planes of Antoine Caron's painting The Massacre Under the Triumvirate from 1566. Margulis analyzes Os Tiranos in a short and explanatory text published in the 5th issue of the journal Habitat, then edited by Lina Bobardi. Oops. This is the painting at the Casa de Vidro, Lina Bobardi's house. And this is Margulis' article in Habitat. The text opens with a reproduction of Caron's painting in black and white. However, the painting is, as you've seen, marked by a series of superimposed frames of different sizes, some of them numbered, and a series of intersecting diagonal lines, some of them dashed, perspectival lines, that link pairs of rectangles or established a relation with the master frame that takes up the entire painting. Upon closer inspection, one notes that the rectangles frames, though of different sizes, are proportioned according to the aspect ratio of the 35 millimeters frame. According to Margulis, the incorporation of dynamism into the static painting allowed for new emotions to emerge in front of nearly imperceptible details. Some of the photographic planes in which Caron's painting is broken down are illustrated in the essay. Bobardi's engagement with cinema is well documented, and this is, I think, one of the examples or best examples of this engagement. There, Bobardi's ethnoanthropological project intersected with cinema, and the museum was finally set in motion. Art history and cinematic explorations brings us back to the notion of the image and its politics. In the museum, paintings approximated the act of picture-making. Recall Velázquez Las Meninas. This lived experience ultimately speaks of a non-linear time, and in Bobardi's own words, linear time is a Western invention. Time is not linear, it's a marvelous entanglement, where at any moment points can be chosen and solutions invented, without beginning or end. What is of interest here is Bobardi's concern with non-Western time, with the time of the other in history and the synchronous other. a topical instance of her ethnoanthropological project, articulated both within her Paulista intellectual milieu and in her ethnographic experiences in the Brazilian Northeast in the context of successive museographic and curatorial projects. Here, Bobardi provides a compelling cue of her interest in articulating a notion of modernity that is substantially imbricated in the non-modern other. Importantly, a notion of modernity that rejects all great divide theories. The absence of this baseline, the retreat of this granular time, fosters the conditions for new invasions. This ethnoanthropological disposition brings to mind Warburg's cultural project, synthesized in his Bilder Atlas. As George D.D. Uberman demonstrates, Warburg's project was certainly anthropological in scope, and images were read as anthropological markers and carriers. Indeed, D.D. Uberman suggests that anthropology, and I quote, displaces and defamiliarizes, one might almost say disquiets art history, end quote. Anthropology also disquiets art history, architecture, and its medium is the image. Images disquiet architecture too. For images are anthropological carriers, but also and foremost carriers of life. Sentient life is fundamentally composed of all sorts of images. Despite their unique ontological status, images reside within sentient life, in our human bodies and beyond. As Emmanuel Coccia argues, and I quote, there is a bond between life and images, end quote. Images reveal connections and delineate continuities between things and beings that once seemed utterly antagonistic. Recall Warburg, in the museographic display of the MASP, architecture's temporality is engulfed by a confabulation of images, anachronic and heterochronic planes superimposed, opening up the territory of the other, and crucially, I'm on time? Okay, just almost done, yeah. 3 minutes. And crucially, this superimposition of images inaugurates a form of non-linguistic communication. We can call it a communal stage of the gaze. One could hypothesize that Bobardi's visual strategy recuperates the rhetorical experience of alterity, installing the other in continuity with the same. It is ultimately the image that, in its successive pliant planes, to borrow from Giuliana, encounters the body and makes it a provisional host. And yet I propose to read this image-body exchanges in a more bodily or intense way, biologically, zoologically, effectively, and even animalistically. I thus take Bobardi's museography as a topical thought experiment that actualizes, even if in a provisional, experimental way, an entanglement of culture and the ethnoanthropological agency discovered in various forms of otherness. The museum foregrounds and foreshadows, in a visually and spatially codified manner, architecture's potential agency for a form of multi-species or beyond a human inhabitation, in which art performs in its more animal way, confronting its own cultural status with that which emerges from our or others' animal reserve. If, as Elizabeth Gross argued, architecture and all the arts that follow from it are linked to the birdsong, then there must be a good start. Art begins with the animal. Nevertheless, it relies on the primacy of the body as the locus of subjective vision and on the combined coupling of bodies and paintings to the extent of their cognitive interchangeability. Pictorial space and living space converge within the architectural milieu. Beyond perspectival symbolism, bodies and paintings constellate in that communal stage of the gaze. This type of perspectival dislocation is more akin to the type of perspectivism that regulates Viveiros de Castro's cannibal metaphysics. And metaphysics of predation shared by virtually all peoples of the New World. This is a world composed of a multiplicity of points of view, and there are, and as quote Viveiros de Castro, indefinitely many possible worlds, end quote. The world is thus experienced as an effective multiplicity. A perspective, in the sense described by Viveros de Castro, is not a representation, it's not a property of the mind. A point of view is in the body. For Viveros de Castro's metaphysics of predation, the origin and locus of perspectivism, its cosmological modality, is a middle, an actual plane that is the body qua bundle of affects. And I quote, perspectivism is a corporeal mannerism. Predating Viveros de Castro, and I'm concluding, and armed with a hands-on ethnographic experience, Bobardi conceived of nature not as a fixed universal, but rather as a multiple, variable, affective, and reactive milieu. It could be argued that this is a form of multinaturalism avant la lettre. Consider the notion of culture proposed by Viveros de Castro. Our current idea of culture projects an anthropological landscape, people by marble status, not one made of myrtle, a classical museum rather than a Baroque garden. Indeed, the museography of the Maspi advances an heterodox idea of culture, one that is more akin to a garden, always proliferating, always growing. To reconfigure the territory of art in the museum as a territory of predation opens the possibility of reassessing one of Brazil's most enduring modern anti-modern motifs, anthropophagy, neither as an appealing exoticism in the tradition of Michel de Montaigne, Oswald de Andrade, Hans de Staden, or Theodore de Vries, nor in Haroldo de Campos' translationism, but rather as a site of ethnoanthropological inquiry that connects visual media, particularly the image, as an anthropological carrier, with the zoobotanical and geological, encompassing all sentient beings in a singular form of creatory rhetorics. And this is Lina Bobardi's turtle in the Casa de Vidro. And to conclude, this is the last paragraph, I promise. I therefore hypothesize that Bobardi's quasi-anthropomorphic dispositive offers important micro-lessons for a redefinition of the relationship between body, space, and architecture that altogether defined a new body, subject, environmentally attached to culture. In so doing, Bobardi's provisionally, yet precautiously, intervenes in the fundamental dichotomy of nature-culture from a twofold perspective. First, destabilizing the body qua modern body. Second, endorsing paintings with an eerie animate agency, for paintings in the museum are standing upright. Irreducible to a modern body or to the modern museographic machinery, that's the classical museum. In Bobardi's museum, the colonized body was thus reimagined alongside multiple other bodies, an assemblage of animal and human-animal others. The result is enthralling, a body multiple, hospitable, intensely constellated, and the beholder of a communal stage of the long gaze. In the paradoxical gesture of a standing upright, culturally anchored, the body human was made into an explorer and, more provocatively, a predator. And this is only a work in progress that I wanted to show as a conclusion, which is basically exploring this distinction between the visual and the textual in the museum and the way in which the interest or the complex thing really emerges at the articulation of both systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was such a thought-provoking presentation. We are still on time, so yeah, don't worry. We have our last presentation. Our fourth and last presenter for today is Yazmín Crespo. Yazmín Crespo is a Puerto Rican architect, researcher, educator, and historian. Her scholarship explores architectural and cultural counter-narratives as a collective experience, addressing the relationship between architecture, education, media, and territory. She's an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, affiliated with the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Yazmín studied with Giuliana as a graduate student here at the GSD, and last spring she received her PhD in the history and theory of architecture. Her presentation is titled Atmospheric Thinking and Senti Pensar. Please join me in welcoming Yazmín Crespo. No, you don't need to.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us as we celebrate the symposium in honor of Professor Giuliana Bruno. Yes. This presentation is a performative text that uses scripted words as a medium to engage in layered conversations on atmospheric thinking, senti pensar, translation, and counter-narratives. It embraces archipelagic thinking as it navigates ideas across matters, from text to image and back again, by exploring sight, seeing, and feeling as a practice of interconnected islands of thought. The presentation cultivates a relational exchange where each perspective builds upon others, fostering a dialogue rich in translation, transformation, and layered understanding. The presentation is a work in progress, once again initiated by Giuliana's words. In 2004, my first encounter with Giuliana Bruno's Atlas of Emotion began a travessia that profoundly resonates with my work. Giuliana's evocative introduction, where she defines her atlas as an errare, a map woven through detours, errors, and wanderings, captures a pedagogy that values deviation and discovery. This notion parallels my engagement with counter-narrative pedagogies, which seek to disrupt dominant discourses by uncovering marginalized histories and creating space for alternative voices. Like Giuliana's psychogeographic approach to sight-seeing and unseen matters as a multiform practice of geopsychic exploration, my works hopes to navigate the intersections of lived experiences, memory, and space in the Americas and the Caribbean. As you can see, Atlas of Emotion has never left my side for 20 years, nor has my admiration for Giuliana. Emotions unfolding dynamically over time have shaped my scholarship of embracing a critical pedagogy of care for a just world. As part of an archipelago that embodies its experimental form, each section of these presentations enacts recollections. The archipelago serves as a familiar setting for the writer and poet Glissant, where the assemblage and its meanings are simultaneously singular and manifold. The presentation itself, you'll see, represents a form of archipelagic thinking in action and performance, a cultural formation of time, space, geographies, and geobodies. It is through this narrative of archipelagic thought that I aim to foreground the interaction between its parts and invite you to embark on an experimental, non-linear path of recollection and action. Senti pensar is a verb that fuses two actions, to feel, sentir, and to think, pensar. As a concept rooted in decolonial thinking, senti pensar weaves, or teje, thoughts and feelings. It is a sensing notion that begins with corporeal and material experience, emphasizing an affective connection between the environment and subjects. It represents co-reasoning with the cosmos, encompassing all meanings and senses, a cartography of emotions. In this context, Bruno concepts parallel senti pensar, which originates in Afro-Colombian and indigenous epistemologies and was popularized initially by sociologist Fals Borda. Senti pensar merges the intellectual and the emotional as inseparable modes of knowledge. stressing that understanding the world requires a combination of intellectual, emotional, and sensory engagement. Giuliana's Bruno atmospheric thinking and the Latin American decolonial concept of sentir pensar focus on integrating thought and emotion in the comprehension of space, materiality, and knowledge production. These frameworks critique dominant Western epistemologies that separate reason from emotion, instead proposing more embodied and relational ways of knowing. Bruno's atmospheric thinking, as articulated in her seminal work, Atlas of Emotion, theorizes that space is not merely functional or neutral, but emotionally charged and shaped by affect. Atmospheres are formed through sensory experiences, such as light, texture, and sound, and evoke emotional responses that affect how individuals perceive and engage with spaces, allowing for a deeper understanding of cultural histories. She highlights how art and architecture creates affective environments that evoke emotional and political responses. She argues that artistic practices can challenge dominant cultural narratives and illuminate the histories embedded within materiality. This perspective aligns with sentir pensar, which operates within a decolonial aesthetic framework. Artists like Cuitca, Salcedo, and Bobardi use space, mapping, and materiality as vehicles for affective engagement, evoking emotion and confronting colonial histories. For example, Salcedo, Topografía de la Guerra, reconfigures public space to address collective trauma and displacement, embodying the emotional and historical depth that Bruno's atmospheric thinking articulates. By integrating these frameworks, the preservation hopes to tejer Giuliana's Bruno's work, mapping a nuanced perspectives on how spaces function as affective terrains that communicate histories, emotions, and political meanings, offering critical tools for artistic practice and scholarly inquiry across the Americas and beyond. Drawing from philosophical traditions that emphasize embodied knowledge, Bruno's work resonates with my own academic journey. Her approach to pedagogy, grounded in atmospheric thinking and emotion, has shaped my teaching philosophy, encouraging embodied, critically engaged frameworks that center lived experiences. This aligns with the decolonial and feminist pedagogies I aim to cultivate, as emphasized by Paulo Freire in his call for education, that is relational and participatory, a practice that acknowledges the emotional and intellectual dimensions of learning. Mendieta's manipulation of the landscape can be associated with shadowboxing, where she sculpts atmospheres that allow the elements to leave their mark, thus drawing the struggle closer to the earth, as though attempting to overpower the feminine form by eroding the ground and transcending temporal boundaries. This approach also resonates with Giuliana's conception of atmosphere as more than a traditional space, and I'm quoting, but as a milieu, a projective environmental force that shapes and influences experiences, end of quote. Informed by Bruno's work, I understand that environments as layers with emotions, histories, and memories, aligning with Gaston Bachelard's philosophical view that space is not merely a physical construct, but a site for poetic imagination and material and emotional resonance. This allows for the recognition of space as dynamic and relational, shaped not only by its material constitution, but also by the affective dimensions that emerge through its interaction with those who inhabit or engage with it. Giuliana Bruno also emphasizes that, and I'm quoting, to translate is to touch. It is to bring the far to the near, to carry, to hold. Translation is an act of transport, a passage between worlds, end of quote. This idea of translation as a tactile, immersive act resonates deeply with the philosophical underpinnings of my work, particularly the relationship to Lydia Clark's participatory practices. As I have noted, Clark's exploration of the body and perception through her prosthetic experiments touches on the very essence of perception itself. Building on this relational approach, I conceptualize Caribbean identity and space, a framework that challenges colonial territorial separations and instead envisions Caribbean identity as a fluid, interconnected network of histories and cultures. Once again, I'm quoting Giuliana. These concepts aligns with Glissant's Poetics of Relation, where he argues that true understanding emerges from the relational exchange between diverse cultures, emphasizing the value of difference rather than its erasure. These relational perspectives informs my work with Taller Creando Sin Encargos, where we engage in collaborative projects that cultivate networks of local decolonial practices across Puerto Rican communities. Edward Glissant's archipelagic thinking complements and expands these notions of atmospheres by situating knowledge, identity, and relationality in the physical and cultural landscapes of Caribbean islands. Yes, Emilio. Yo te hablo en tu lengua, pero te comprendo en la mía. Glissant conceptualized the Caribbean not as a single homogeneous entity, but as a dynamic archipelago, a set of interconnected islands with unique histories, cultures, and languages that nonetheless relate to one another through shared struggles and histories. His Poetics of Relation extends this framework, emphasizing translation, metaphors, and multiplicity as vehicles for connection across difference. For example, Glissant's concept of opacity, the right to remain partially incomprehensible, functions much like atmospheric thinking in resisting complete intellectual transparency, instead valuing the ambiguity and richness of embodied experience. Bruno's atmospheres, like Glissant's Poetics of Relation, highlight knowledge as a texture, layer experience that involves both seeing and feeling, perceiving and engaging. However, for Glissant, translation is inherently opaque. It is an act that doesn't reveal all, but instead preserves mystery, blurriness. Bruno often views translation as a tactile act, bringing us closer to the material or emotional essence of things through surfaces and textures, applying relational thinking to spatial and material aesthetics. Both emphasize movement, Bruno through spatial and emotional terms, and Glissant through cultural and historical terms. Bruno's view of translation as transport resonates with Glissant's view of cultural exchange as an act of connection that accepts opacity rather than demanding clarity. In understanding the emotional and sensory dimensions of mobility, it is crucial to attune ourselves to how spaces are felt and experienced through the body. As Scheller exerts, this involves recognizing the atmospheres we inhabit and co-create, atmospheres shaped by the histories of power, inequality, and resistance that inform our movements. Similarly, also Bruno reflects on her immediate sense of belonging upon arriving in Havana, encapsulate the affective power of place. And I'm quoting, "I too felt at home the moment I set foot in Havana. I too felt the urge and the pleasure to write." End of quote. This recognition of space as an emotional and sensory experience aligns with her atmospheric thinking because it emphasizes the interconnectedness of space and the bodily sensations that come with navigating it. She finds a meaningful counterpart in Glissant's archipelagic approach, in that both embrace relational, immersive forms of understanding, although in different contexts. For Glissant, metaphors act like Bruno's textiles, connective tissues that link disparate places, people, and experiences, forging on understanding grounded in shared lived experiences. Translation, too, serves as a bridge, allowing meanings to flow between languages, landscapes, and people, in a way that respects both difference and connection. In exploring the interconnectedness between emotionally, sensory, and spatial dimensions, Bruno introduces the concept of a tender geography, which is particularly attuned to gender and lived experiences. This tender geography maps a moving anatomy of space, reflecting the fluid, embodied, and nature of human existence within it. Spaces that are both inhabited and transformed by those who occupy them. Her emphasis on the relationality of geography resonates with Quitka's map works, which transcend traditional cartography by operating as form of archipelagic thinking. Quitka's map, as Aguirre notes, do not chart geographic territories in a linear fashion, but instead create fragmented, interconnected spaces. These works mirror the dynamics of an archipelago, where boundaries blur and connections emerge across scattered points, highlighting the complex, non-linear relationships that shape our understanding of place. Ultimately, Bruno's tender geographies, Quitka archipelagic thinking, and Bachelard's poetics of space converge to offer a rich embodied understanding of space that resists linear, fixed representations. A mural that subverts the iconography of another time, it dislocates history, carve an existential sentence into the wall, a perforated wall that configures the map of the world, the revival of a myth about the water sources that give rise to a city, the fiction of scenography that calls for the annihilation of a monument. Invent a visual universe that brings forth the perversions and corrupt acts of human scenarios from the underground, the embracing gaze of the dispossessed, an injured river, the skin of its rocks that contains memory, the domestic strategy that mitigates the disaster, unearthing, digging up the remnants of ancestors and making them material, swallowing the warmth of the earth, the imposing rocky geological formation, red threads in descent, the margin, the grid. This perspective aligns with indigenous practices of sentipensar, wherein the relationships between feeling and thinking is not viewed as a dualistic separation, but rather as a holistic ontology rooted in relationality. In this framework, sensory and emotion experiences are essential to understanding of reality, emphasizing profound, embodied connection to the land, spirits, and the environment. As Cepeda asserts, starting from the natural interconnection of one with each other and everyone to everyone, under the horizon of sensing sensitivity, indigenous knowledge systems position the world as inherently interconnected, where sentipensar serves as both a method of knowing and a means of existing in relation to the world. Bruno's insights on the wall of pictures in Atlas, where images are mobilized emotionally and transformed into narratives, further deepens our understanding of how spaces and surfaces functions as carriers of affect. The surfaces she describes are not static, but are activated by emotional mobilization, which allows them to transcend the physical form and become part of a larger relational narrative. In the Caribbean context, as exemplified by the photo of La Perla, this relational approach to surface and material becomes an essential tool for understanding the emotional and historical weight carried by specific spaces. This aligns in a way with the work of Derrida, who argue that surfaces bear the traces of histories, offering a space for both memory and transformation. In my writing, I explore how material objects and bodies serve as carriers of cultural memory and affect. The Caribbean, as a site of historical trauma and resilience, becomes a space where the material emotional dimensions of history are deeply intertwined. In Lina's words, to teach is to construct. Yet, whoever it is that teaches theory cannot fail to be an architect. End of quote. This statement underscores the inseparable link between theory and practice in her work, where the physicality of architecture becomes a medium for engaging with histories of marginalization, resistance, and ways of thinking, feeling. layers of elective affinities in art and design, which can be understood as the ways in which different elements, historical, cultural, and sensory, come together to form a rich experience. The architectural history of the Colaborativo Teatro Oficina has been an urbanistic laboratory for 60 years of anthropophagy, architectura nova, the right to the city, developing parallel with Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, Augusto Boll's theater of the oppressed, Tropicalia aesthetics, and the participatory theory movement that rises up from the streets. The architectural urbanistic account of Teatro Oficina, Alina Bobardi's, aim to underline the made-up separation between theory and practice, and highlight radically emancipatory forms of urbanism that are rather latent, yes, systemically suppressed within contemporary cities. For Lina, the artist's freedom has always been individual, but true freedom can only be collective. A freedom aware of social responsibilities, which can knock down the frontiers of aesthetics, end of quote. A collective awareness is necessary. Any delay is a crime at this stage. The act of being alive, as Kosha states, coincides with living together, inhabiting the same world, belonging to the same element, end of quote. This is crucial to understanding how the metaphor of the border can be expanded beyond a static political boundary to encompass a more affective shared experience. The border, therefore, does not simply divide, but serves as a site of intersection where individual and collective experiences are intertwined. The phrase, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," captures this notion of a living shadow, where the border is not merely a geographic marker, but an active, shifting force that shapes experiences. The pedagogical approaches articulated by Freire and bell hooks challenge the traditional structures of education, advocating for a shift in the power dynamics of teaching and learning. Freire's notion that knowledge is not something given and already finished, it is a social practice that requires the transformative action of people over the world, underscores the role of education in fostering critical consciousness and social transformation. This perspective aligns with Hooke's emphasis on education as a practice of freedom, where learning becomes a liberatory process that empowers students to engage with the world in transformative ways. For them, education is not merely the transmission of information, but a participatory and active process where students or teachers are co-creators of knowledge. Sentir pensar as a political tool has been discussed within the colonial and indigenous epistemologies, highlighting his potential to disrupt traditional Western knowledge system. This notion is explored in depth by scholars like Arturo Escobar, who in Pluriversal Politics emphasizes that Sentir pensar offers a path for decolonizing thought and practice. Escobar works engaged with the idea that integrating emotion and thought leads to a more relational and collective form of knowledge that is central to social and political transformation. Further, Sentir pensar allies with the politics of relational ontologies as proposed by Glissant and others who argue for a multiplicity of worlds that coexist in a state of constant interaction and translation. By embracing Sentir pensar, these ontologies allow for a more broader understanding of a political action that transcends the individual, focusing instead on the relational dynamics that connect communities, environments, and histories. These approaches contribute to what some scholars call affective politics or ontological politics, as they challenge the dominant linear narratives of history and development imposed by colonial structures. But you know, Giuliana Bruno's work on atmospheric thinking predates the specific discourse around affective politics. Her concept of atmospheres as emotionally charged relational spaces in her works, particularly in Atlas, was foundational in examining the intersections of space, affect, and politics. Alicia Villarreal Art's work, Grabar el Territorio, exemplifies the convergence of memory and emotion, embodying the principles of Sentir pensar, Through her practice, Lan is marked both physically and culturally, forging an emotional imprint that shapes collective histories. This aligns with critical pedagogy's stance that education is inherently political, emphasizes the need for spatial agency and dissident critics to challenge traditional hegemonic frameworks by fostering social justice and constructing more equitable futures within and beyond the classroom. These pupitres critique traditional education systems, aligning with Freire's concept of banking education. The artwork, through the symbolism of desk, confronts the erasure of marginalized voices in institutionalized learning. It transforms these spaces into sites of resistance, offering a counter-narrative that challenges passive education and embraces a participatory decolonial pedagogy. By disrupting narration sickness, pupitres foster a space for reclaiming suppressed histories and engaging with more inclusive, radical forms of knowledge. In my teaching and practice, these concepts have informed a critical approach to architecture that privileges relationality, materiality, and collective agency. By adopting an errant pedagogy learned more than 20 years ago, one that embraces wondering and questioning, I aim to equip students with tools to reimagine architecture as a field rooted in community engagement and decolonial practices. Giuliana's Atlas of Emotion remains an enduring guide, mapping pathways for transformative practices that challenge traditional boundaries and center narratives from the peripheries. Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes. Yeah. Thank you all for staying with us. What is art, what is film, what is architecture, if not the struggle against time, right? That's what we do. That's what we are expert in. I want to summarize some of the things we have been saying in the second panel, just a way to set the stage. Then we started with your classroom lessons, thinking about the vivid descriptions of ekphrasis as an operation that moves us from the rhetorical to the pedagogical. And we ended up in the seminar room, a space that we all know really well. Quite a fitting end if we think that the term seminar comes from agricultural practice, from seeding the soil, which was the perfect starting point for Becca's discussion of eco-political and environmental images. Becca, with you, we explored the interplay of diverse environmental dimensions, from the physical spaces represented by cinema to a mental space that informs cinematic practice. Your approach is reminiscent of Giuliana's topographical analysis and intersects a metaphorical dimension, which reminds me also of Giuliana's metaphorical movements. In your case, this is where films are discussed as seeds for thought, something from which we can retrace even the germination of ecological awareness. Martín, in your work, that metaphorical dimension then challenges the linguistic apparatus of museography. As in Lina Bombardi's famous display, the images face one direction, the writing faces the opposite direction. The metaphor, perhaps, is what allows us to break that dichotomy. But it was your methodology that made me think once again of Giuliana's early prototype of media archaeology, street walking on a ruined map. In particular, her emphasis on historical gaps, fragments, a form of archaeological looking that is stitching together fragments through descriptions and narratives that also echo the ekphrasis that Dan's first presentation tackled. At the end, you almost dissolved Bobardi's architecture, imagining a museum without walls, which becomes an open space, a space open to new theoretical speculation, and perhaps also a ground for new anthropological analysis. And I would say this opening up was finally filled, so to say, by Yazmín's discussion of senti pensar, a concept that is rooted in Colombian indigenous communities and that echoes the affects of affective thinking that all students of Giuliana are intimately familiar with. Here, the conceptual resonance between Giuliana's work and Glissant's Poetics of Relations describe a transformative and poetic mode of historiography that embraces space and affect. This is what I heard. This is what I would like you to respond to. And of course, we're also here to take questions from the public. So if you also want to raise your hands and intervene, I'll keep track of what's happening. Okay. We have one question there. Do you want, yeah, I mean, it's up to you if you want to respond to me or also, yeah, please ask your question.
Okay, hello, thank you so much for that. That was a really fascinating series of expositions. So I was wondering a little bit about the relationship between ekphrasis and ecstasy, as well as the relationship of that to aperture being a medium, and then also to, I think, the space of metaphor a little bit, or a transition between one space to another that I think I also see in your work. And then what I really wanted to know is what kind of space these ideas are conceiving of that's an alternative to the hegemonic one. Becca had said that, she's thinking about how her history is created within history, if at the margins, but it has to be something that percolates and creates kind of like a bubble or an atmosphere within an atmosphere, and that's what gives something the room to grow and breathe and become transformative within it, I think. And so I'm thinking about ecstasy as its position between stasis as a starting point and stasis as an ending point, say between like a constructed city and then the ruins of one. The ecstasy as the energy of the thing that kind of shoots it beyond the trajectory of just falling in a linear path straight down, and instead allows it to kind of liberate itself in a way, almost like if you have a gymnast vaulting a vault, right at the moment that they reach the top, there's like an act of suspension. And that is kind of like a moment of ecstasy where you seem kind of beyond time or beyond space in a traditional sense. You are creating that space in a sense. And that's, that's it. If you could weigh in, that would be awesome.
Thank you, both Emilio and for your invitation. I was thinking when you were talking about some of these ideas, and I was thinking about ekphrasis and radio, because now I'm working in radio, and they describe it as a visual medium, that it is the medium for pictures, which is counterintuitive until you think about it. And it really sparks my imagination as a writer, because I know I have to paint pictures for people's ears, and that is the way to think. So back to the Marilyn Stratton quotation, it matters what ideas we use to think other ideas with. I find that if I teach or broadcast or write through an idea, through something abstract, it doesn't land, but you do it through an image, and you're using the reader or the listener's embodied senses, then you're working, this is a form of ekphrasis, but you're working in a very sensual way, which becomes conceptual and also political, and that's where I like to then you can move into feminist thought, you can move into anti-colonial thought. So exactly, you start small, start simple, and then explode.
That's interesting that you bring up radio. I think I'm also very indebted to W.J.T. Mitchell's Ekphrasis and the Other. And he starts his essay itself with this notion of radio broadcasters, like talk about, oh, I wish you could see this photo, right? And they use it as a playful way. But he also then develops this, and I borrow the term ekphrastic hope, is this notion that there is an ability to constantly translate and that there is no loss. But there's also ekphrastic fear that this is always an impossibility and that that's the boundary. And I think what I find so, even just hearing people respond and the way in which you are descriptive and the way in which you need words to do certain things, that's also what I feel like Giuliana was so good at. And like what I would see after grading so many papers and of how students would take from your work, it was also this notion that like you inspire people to write and you inspire them to write in a way that describes fully. And I was just trying to reflect on that and also, make it slightly scholarly, but.
I think what's beautiful is that each of you, and actually this should be extended also to the first panel, has also opened a new space of scholarly research, right? A way of thinking through space while also creating a space of investigation that goes from bare metal to cosmic radiations to the methane that is coming out of the Staten Island. It's every single example, it's also a way of configuring a space for thought. And that's also, I think, part of what we learned from Giuliana, like really thinking about the ways in which theory is also a practice, right? If theory is vision, then it is a way of seeing, and it is also a way of creating in terms of like how we read what we see.
If I may add a thing to that, I think one thing that's always been inspiring about Giuliana's work is you also find images which are full of hope and beauty and remind people that they have a body and it's sensual and that looking can be incredible. And like the first book, my book that I was discussing, it's written in a context of climate breakdown and multiple conflicts and looking to the past when people were, these people embroiled in struggle. But I was interested in telling another story, and that's not to efface the first story or the negative images, but it's understanding that images, as you say, are a way of thinking, and if you show an alternative space, like we need to know that the land was polluted or despoiled, but also there are histories of people doing amazing things on the land, and sometimes those images are not shown as much, and they're so important.
I think that, I just wanted to say one little thing about counter-pedagogies. I feel like, what we learn, or I learn, Giuliana's classroom, is that to meet there, every day for class, it's not only about countering pedagogies. It was, and learn, it was also, or mostly, about relearning together. And the counter-narratives are usually described as the little stories, the stories of the marginalized, women's stories. And I remember that on her book, but also on her articles, I could find people that I will feel identified. No, I still remember the first time that I saw Rebecca Horn's mechanical prosthetics, at Giuliana's class. The same way that I can also remember seeing environments that I was wondering, is it an environment? It's not an island. What does that mean, environment? And I feel like all of us, at the end, the way that we hope we teach and the hope that we are trying to write and share our scholarships are through the same, at least from my perspective, through the same methods of relationality and opacity. So.
I think that I just want to add one thing, and if we think of all the presentations, and I'm including the ones in the first panel, I think in every case, or almost every case, the images were used to break boundaries or definitions or dualities in a way. And I have written down a few of them: stasis, kinesis, animal, human, that was mine, reason, affect, virtual, material, real, representational. And indeed, I think that images are very, or almost ideal vehicles to express relations of tension, ambiguity, multiplicity, probably because their very nature they work as time containers in a way, and narrative containers in a way. And in our minds, images linger in much more unpredictable ways than language probably. So that's why they are a very apt instrument to think those intersections and entanglements between things that we tend to construct as dualities. And this is, of course, the project of ontological anthropology that I tried to bring up in my presentation, right?
Yes, I mean, for me it was very evident how all of these dualities are put in, they're seen through a different perspective, which allows us to both break the dichotomy, but also question the very logic of creating those binary oppositions. Like when we think about nature and culture, or, you know, is it technical or cultural, or is it like the museum, is it like built or natural environment? We're actually exploding all of these categories, which also traditionally it means disciplinary frameworks. And I think what we also learned from Giuliana is how to work through different disciplinary framework, how to traverse those spaces as well to think in a transversal way. And I think I saw that in all of your presentations as well.
May I add something? And I think that in that same direction, this idea of thinking in these entanglements and sort of transitions and tensions is really kind of urgent for any of the current challenges that we have, whether environmental, social, or technological. It's like the mode or the modality of thinking that we need to apply and consider.
Yeah. We might have time only for one more question.
Well, can I take what Michael was just saying to me? Thank you for these love letters, and I can always respond with how much love, appreciation, and admiration I have for all of you and for this fantastic way that you've taken a certain way of thinking in your own direction, and it's my greatest pleasure to see how all of these connections that I've tried to put together, becoming a architectural historian, an art historian, a cartographer, doubling in the history of science while being trained as a film theorist and having a real passion for aesthetics and philosophy and thinking have taken shape in each one of your work. And I just wanted to pick up on this idea that you were saying about entanglement, because it takes us to the next panel, which is really about Isaac Julian's and my collaboration with him on this book about Lina Bobardi's and his work on marvelous entanglement. And this idea of entanglement, which is a sort of, also rooted in roots. It's not just a seed, but something that actually sprouts and connects relationally through things is something that I see in everyone's work. And it's not, and when you're saying images, I also think, that was forceful here was that, yes, that sometimes in media studies there's been a shying away from it and thinking that infrastructures do not have to have anything to do with representation. And in all of your works, there was a deep, deep interest in thinking theoretically, politically, socially about infrastructures through, in a way, spaces, not just images, but spaces, perhaps we should say environments. And I like the sense of hope, especially in this miserable world, and where, I feel it's more and more important to bring this up. I like to call it projective imagination, to be able to sort of utopianly imagine these connections rather than wallowing in how desperate the situations are, and not taking the route of even thinking that everything is negative, including projection. In my last book, projection, I really go against the idea that projection is just about throwing your negative feelings on other people or other spaces, and and embracing the paranoia of media, which means the isolation from the world, right? So something we've been seeing in media studies, which is projection as protection from the world. And everything I've seen here is no protection from the world. It's just throwing yourself in there and trying to make a change. And I really, really admire everything that everybody is doing, and I will continue to follow you forever. You won't get rid of me. Thank you.
Thank you.